Hi, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. Today I want to do a viewer request profile of a particular country, and that country is Ecuador. Ecuador is a South American country. It's on the northwest coast of the continent of South America. It's been independent from Spain. The colonial power took over Ecuador from indigenous folks about 1500 or so. But Ecuador has been an independent country since 1822. There was sort of a wave of revolutions and this sort of thing in Spain kind of losing focus on this area. But nonetheless, it was pretty lightly populated for some time. However, in more modern times, it has developed fairly quickly. Geologically speaking, it's largely composed of three sort of zones. You've got a coastal region, which is of course on the Pacific, a steep valley kind of network. The valleys themselves run east to west. That range runs north to south. And then you've got some very high mountains in the eastern part of the country. And this means that much of the connections that Ecuador has with its neighbors are north-south. Extremely difficult, of course, to cross mountain ranges of any kind, and these mountain ranges are particularly imposing. Several volcanoes in those mountain ranges, notably. Population of Ecuador currently stands at about 18 million. About half of the folks live in that sort of range and valley province, and about half of them live on a relatively thin coastal strip. There's two major cities, Quito being one of those, and a lot of people, of course. Those are pretty densely populated. Economically speaking, the economy of Ecuador is based on commodities largely, shellfish, fishing, and oil. Some agricultural products in the form mostly of bananas. They have some other industry, light industry and things like that, but primarily their economy is commodities based, which as we know is somewhat kind of risky. As far as their economic performance, currently their GDP per capita is about 14,500, which isn't bad. Inequality for South America is also not too bad. And their inflation rate's about 2%, which is great for South America. And they have about 3% unemployment. I kind of question that. I wonder if there's an underemployment figure that we might get, but not that bad. Their biggest import and export partners are China and the United States, respectively. Sometimes those kind of slip back and forth. Tariffs may impact that. There's a 10% tariff on Ecuador, despite the fact that the United States has a trade surplus with Ecuador. Politically, it's a dicey situation at the moment, and sometimes has been in the past too. So when we think about Freedom House, you may recall that I look to this sometimes, Freedom House democracy scores. They rank 65 out of 100, which means they're partly free. Now, the institutions of the state itself, the court, the legislature, the presidency, those sorts of things are independent of one another and function pretty well in good times. However, they've seen over the past 5 to 7 years kind of a wave of violent crime. Murder rate right now stands at 45 per 100,000. Just as a comparison, the United States murder rate, and we're known as sort of a violent country, is about 6.5 per 100,000 people. Criminal gangs and transnational criminal gangs are a major challenge and have become increasingly influential and powerful. Political assassinations have become more common. The intimidation of journalists, judges, police by these criminal gangs has become a real challenge. Ecuador is a drug transit country. A lot of drugs are moving from other places through Ecuador to be exported to the United States and elsewhere, but mostly the United States. These folks are organized, clearly well-funded, and vicious. They have an effective police force in some places, but in other places not so much. And that has led the military, which has a constitutional role to do this, to be active at times against these criminal gangs. One more note about the criminal gang challenge. I've noticed in doing this review that the wealthier people tend to end up living in secured, gated communities. These are not necessarily secured by police, but rather by private security firms. This is a dynamic that used to happen quite a bit in Venezuela, probably still does, I don't know. But it's something that I have observed in South Africa. The rich people can afford to have security, so they essentially create communities that are isolated from everybody else, even within a city. Shops and their schools and everything like that are located there. And that isolates them from the rest of the Ecuadorian community. It's a challenge. And oddly enough, given the low rate of inequality in the country, you would think if you could get a handle on this criminal gang issue, probably be in a much better place to have a really thriving country and a promising democracy. 2003, they impeached the former president for corruption. This led to early elections rather than simply a replacement sort of thing. So they had early elections in 2023. The new president is Daniel Noboa. Presidents can only serve for one term contiguously. So they can serve a term, they would have to take a term off, then they could run again. I'm not sure how many times that's happened, but interesting little twist on that institutional feature. Some of the other troubles that they've had is that over the last several years had an influx of refugees from Venezuela, mostly about 500,000 Venezuelan refugees are in Ecuador. That's been a challenge for sure to make sure those folks assimilate in some way. And the military too has had autonomy in the past, political autonomy, which means that sometimes it as an institution expresses thoughts and feelings about policies and particular presidents and things like this. Not a great situation, but one that they've mostly been able to get along with. The military has participated in a few coups over the years, most recently in 2010. Not a huge military, about 40,000, but like many countries, it's a respected institution in many ways. As far as the influence of China within Ecuador, it's fairly substantial. There's a large Chinese presence at many of the ports. China does not own any ports in Ecuador as of right now. They do own a large port in Peru, which is concern for many folks. Another aspect is that Ecuador is, in terms of the people, is very diverse, let alone the Venezuelan folks that have come in. You have a real mix of people. Many languages are spoken there. Indigenous people are very well organized in Ecuador, represented in the legislature and active politically. Most of their concerns are related to acting against oil companies and mining companies, which are, to their view, intruding on their lands and not exactly being the best stewards of things, as we would suspect oil companies and mining companies would not be. Deforestation and thus enhanced flooding is a challenge. Indigenous folks have really organized effectively to protest against those things and to resist them. There's been some agreements to scale some of that back in some places within Ecuador. However, those things haven't been acted upon to the satisfaction of these indigenous groups. And so they continue to raise these issues. So with that, I hope that's interesting to everybody. It goes without saying that I don't know everything. If you have context to share or additional challenges or issues that you know are really important to folks in Ecuador, please put them in the comments. I look forward to your thoughts, and we'll see you again on the next one. Thanks.